Welcome to Poetic Technique. Today we'll be talking about the art of the poetic line. If we speak about the poetic line, we are speaking, of course, about lineated poems. We've seen already in class how poems can be organized according to multiple units or qualities of language: temporality, musicality, poetic gesture, grammatical mood, and so on. What we're going to look at now is how what is contained within a line works with these qualities to organize the contents of a poem and to deliver them to the reader toward an intentional and controlled experience of reading. The first thing to note when speaking about line is we have to differentiate between poems that work in traditional verse forms and those that are free verse. The first category follows rules of meter and rhyme. The constraints are imposed to honor tradition, but also to help generate content. And what I mean by this is the imposition of a constraint upon a poem forces the poet to write and revise toward predetermined structures, and as such, it often leads to material that the poet would not have written otherwise. If you tried your hand this week at writing a syllabic sonnet, you may have found doing so was more difficult than only following the constraints of temporality, focus, point of view, and the number of lines, the constraints that I gave you for the dramatic monologue and the ode. For me, writing form-based poems with strict rules kind of feels like playing Scrabble or, on my phone, wordscapes or word stacks. You know what you're looking for, you know the rules, and it's often really hard to find just the right word. That's kind of the point, among other things, of constraints. They force you to find the best word, to put it in the best order. Then, on the other side of things, we have free verse poems. And these poems don't have the same exact constraints as traditional forms. It's not to say they operate without rules. We've seen how different genres require certain foci, no matter the presence or lack of formal constraint. Instead, what we have in free verse poems is a greater emphasis placed on poetic structures and stuff other than rhyme and meter. I'll give an example. My first mentor told me that when you read a free verse poem, especially one that uses what we call the open field, you should take a short pause at the end of a line and a full pause or a breath when you reach a stanza break. So let me show you what this might look like. We'll look at from a poem called Infidelity by Timothy Liu. Like a baby left in a shopping cart, ambling down an unattended hill, does it matter if the thing was gaining speed? Reading this part of the poem this way, with the pauses where they're indicated by the line, helps us focus on each unit of meaning as it's presented. And doing so forces us as readers to focus both on what's contained within each line and what might be possible. I'll say it again, when we read with short pauses, we focus more on what's in each line and what might happen after that line. So for example, when I pause after reading "Like a baby left," my mind immediately tries to fill in those blanks. It looks for the answer to this question: what is like a baby left? When I pause after "in a shopping cart, ambling down" for a full breath, I feel the tension of these lines' situation. Ambling down what? And will the baby be okay? The lines here operate as a sort of sheet music, if you will, instructing me when to pause. They draw attention to the drama of creating and communicating thought, meaning. This isn't always the best way to read a line, however. Consider the sonnet. Given a traditional sonnet is organized according to rhyme and meter, the end of each line is constrained by these formal restrictions. So the sonneteer may or may not choose to create the same types of tension between lines. Great sonneteers often do, but only when it serves the purpose of the poem. A free verse poem incorporates important structural elements of traditional verse forms, such as shifts in tense and point of view, such as the volta, but it takes more liberty over where to place those elements. So if I'm reading a sonnet, I might not breathe the same way through a poem. I might not look to the line to organize the poem's content the same way a free verse poem might organize that content. What I've just talked about illustrates part of the difficulty of attempting to speak to the art of the poetic line comprehensively, which is that the forms poetry takes are infinite, and as such, the points and purposes of poetic line are also too diverse to be adequately summarized. What we can do then, as practitioners of this art form, is study the lines that move us most and learn what they contain, how they establish expectations and respond to them vertically down the page of the poem. Let's look at examples from our previous packet. First, A Small Needful Fact by Ross Gay. A small needful fact is that Eric Garner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticulture Department, which means, perhaps, that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which, most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. Look at the way the poem thinks from one line to the next. A small needful fact is that Eric Garner worked. Enough said. We know the occasion of the poem, which is to communicate what would appear by the title to be a minor, though consequential piece of information. And we know the subject, which is shown in the first line. Eric Garner worked. The next line will tell us where, the third will continue to expand with further specificity, and by the end of the third line, the speaker will begin to make sense of why that matters. Notice where Gay employs repetition in this poem, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood. These repeated words draw attention to the speculative nature of the speaker. The speaker is drawing meaning into the poem's occasion. Perhaps is repeated at the beginning of the fourth and fifth lines, both signaling formal features akin to the villanelle or pantoum, and also emphasizing the speaker's subjectivity. Some variation on the word likely is repeated 3 times at the ends of lines 5, 7, and 8, which further creates touchstones of signification, such as the ones mentioned. Look at also how Gay repeats the word like at the end of the 10th line, and as the first word in lines 12 and 13. Each like is linked to another thing that plants do. By using like in this list toward the end of the 10th line, the speaker introduces the list. By beginning the 12th and 13th lines with this word, each line introduces itself as another item in that list. If we think of some of the gestures we looked at in our last video, we might remember, or even just intuit, how similar language was used to organize poems according to rhetoric. We had the if-then conditional structure, for example. If X happens, Y will follow. Well, what happens if I change where my X and Y are placed? What does the reader focus on when reading each line? I'll make up an example we might consider. If I eat an apple a day, then my teeth will rot. If I eat an apple a day, then my teeth will rot. The difference between these examples is so slight as to appear to carry little meaning alone. We could argue that the first example emphasizes the fact of teeth rotting. Placing this subject-verb grouping alone on the line forces the reader to focus on it. If we place the word then beside this grouping, as in the second instance of this example, we see the functional language beside the active language, then by teeth rotting. And so we focus more on the mechanics of the sentence rather than on the action or the image itself. Going back to Ross Gay's poem, we might notice that there are in fact very few lines that don't contain this sort of mechanical or functional language. Or if they don't, they contain repetitions that remind us on every line this is a person speaking, a person who is trying to make sense of the poem's occasion, of its subject. The speaker is actively involved in turning the small fact into something needful. Without the speaker's imposition, without the persistence of functional language at every turn in this poem, the poem might be read as presenting fact, which it's not. It presents what makes the fact needful. I've heard 1,000,001 useless rules for how to shape a line, and I'd encourage you to listen to none of them. Don't end a sentence with a preposition, for example. Don't end a line with a functional word. Well, generalizing in this way about poetry is an exercise in lobotomy. Reading a poem is the only way to learn how poems work. To learn more about the poetic line, I'll provide you with the text of some of my favorite lineated poems without line breaks. Think of the number of ways you might organize them. Let's try one together. As a warning, I've added some punctuation, though there is no punctuation in the original poem. This is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Let's mix it up. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Let's try it again. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Now let's look at how Williams breaks the lines. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. How does Williams' poem benefit from these extremely short lines? What impact does it have on the way the poem is read? Does it seem more interesting, more urgent? What happens when we make the lines longer than he had them? What effect do line changes have on the poem? That's it for this video. Go ahead and open up your document and make your own line breaks for a few famous poems. Don't cheat. Remember, there is no correct theory or singular theory of line. There are only changes, impacts from the decisions that you make.